Okay, hey everybody. Today is Monday, June 8th, 2026. This is actually episode number 103, okay? I was mistaken. On the last episode I said 101, but it was actually 102. So appreciate you tuning in. For those that don't know, my name is Luther Wilson III, real estate broker, investor, advisor here in the Kansas City market. And a lot of what we do is related to investment properties. Seller financing is one of our specialties. And over the last 15 plus years, I've been able to help several investors in one capacity or another. I myself have been able to invest alongside business partners, solo, with private backers, private money, and so forth. So on this channel, if you're tuning in, I appreciate you. There's a good chance that you are wanting to do real estate investing of some type, or you may already be in the mix doing something real estate related, okay? So hopefully this will be inspirational, educational, and hopefully we can do some business together. I'm definitely looking to collaborate with more people in the near future. Okay, so I've been doing a series talking about what I do as a real estate pro, and this is part number 4. Okay, just to recap, I got into some of my background growing up in the industry, trying a number of different things in the real estate space, and then I got into what I do for marketing, what I've done throughout the years, networking, learning more about real estate, conferences, masterminds, and so forth. And then it led us to today where, on the last video, I talked about what I do when I process a lead, okay? I mentioned some of the go-to people who I consider to be on my team, who I refer and send business to regularly. And then on the last video, I dug in a little bit more about the specifics of what I do when I actually take on a client, because I don't always, have an agreement to represent or assist a client. Okay, there's really 3 main things that I've been helping people with over the last handful of years. Okay, one of those is with seller financing. Okay, another one is assisting or representing investor buyers, okay? And then the third thing is me partnering with someone. It's usually a capital investor, and we go into business together to do real estate investments, okay? So last video, I talked about the process of what I do when I help someone sell a property using seller financing, okay, which I mentioned before is one of my specialties. And then I left off talking briefly about what it looks like when I actually take on a client who is an investor, who is looking to acquire a property, okay? I switched things up a few years ago because I had a lot of things on my plate and I didn't want to get overwhelmed. I felt like I was getting stretched thin doing this, that, and the other. So I started to switch how I operate. And I started in 2022, I started charging upfront fees for investors who want me to help them to acquire an investment property, okay? So I mentioned that on the last video. And I also talked about how some investors may not be ready to make that move. Okay, at this point, I would be somewhat open to negotiating the upfront fee, but more often than not, if they're not able or willing to do that, I simply refer them to someone on my team or another agent who might be able to assist them, okay? So now, what does it look like when I actually take on a client and they are willing and able to pay the upfront fee, and they do pay the upfront fee? Okay, what does that look like? All right, I have an agreement. I know in the last video, I mentioned the importance of agreements, okay, and the power behind them, okay? So when I take on a client, I am going to have something in writing, okay? Whether, again, it's seller financing, whether I'm representing them, or whether I'm going into business and we're going to, invest in real estate together, okay? So let's say I have a buyer that's ready to go, okay? They pay the upfront fee, okay? As part of that, I'm going to have what's called a buyer agency agreement that they sign and I sign. Since I am a licensed real estate broker for the states of Kansas and Missouri, we have to comply. There's certain guidelines, there's rules and regulations that I have to follow, okay? So part of that is having that agreement in place beforehand. So then from there, right, a lot of the investors that I've worked with are wanting fixer-upper properties, okay? So that means that I'm going to have to hit the pavement, I'm going to have to do some outreach, and I'm going to have to find an opportunity, okay? So I, am connected with several real estate agents, real estate brokers, wholesalers, and investors. So, once I have a client, we have our paperwork and ready, they've paid the upfront fee, then I spread the word. I say, hey, we're in buy mode again. Or, hey, I have a client whose buy box looks like X, Y, and Z. However that looks, I'm gonna do some social media outreach. I'm gonna pick up the phone and make some phone calls to agents, wholesalers, and investors I've done deals with in the past. And then I may also do some other form of outreach or marketing. It could be an email blast. It could be me texting several people, individually to spread the word. That takes a lot of time and energy, okay? And then beyond that, I'm gonna want to cast a wide net. So besides just what I mentioned, most of that is gonna be tailored towards properties that are off market, okay? I want to also be open to doing, deals and finding opportunities that are on the open market, that are listed with an agency or brokerage, which means that there's a licensee on the other end, which can be very helpful, okay? I want to leave things open for that because there are opportunities on the open market, fixer-upper opportunities. And there are agents who have pocket listings, okay? I may connect with an agent on one of their listings that may already be under contract, but they oftentimes work in groups or teams, and they oftentimes have, pocket listings and other opportunities that are in the pipeline that they haven't broadcasted or marketed or sent out yet. You get what I'm saying? So when I work, that's part of the reason why I charge upfront fees, because I did it, I don't know how many times, dozens of times with investors in the past. And as the economy has changed and the market has shifted, I see more value in my time and the services that I provide. So in order for me to give my best effort and in order to vet out those investors who may not be as serious. There's a number of reasons why the upfront fee has become a great tool. And would you know, every investor that paid me an upfront fee, we saw success. Their investments, I would need to run it back and follow up with them to see how they are performing. But I would venture to say, of all the clients that I've helped, the ones who have paid the upfront fee or paid me handsomely on the commission of some sort, their investments that I helped them with, my team assisted them with, you tend to perform better than what they did on their own, and they tend to have performed better than what the other agents or whoever brought them opportunities did. I hope this makes sense. So again, I want to encourage the service providers and the operators out there, because that's what I've been doing for a long time, and I feel very passionate about it because I feel like we get slept on. Agents, real estate agents, don't typically have a good reputation, and investors are challenging and tricky to work with at times, but we can make the thing work. I've been able to make it work, and this is how we've been able to do it. Okay, so I mentioned the upfront fee. I mentioned having an agreement in place. I mentioned casting a wide net, looking for fixer-upper opportunities, right? That's what most investors seem to want. As of late, meaning the last 2-3 years, if my client is open to it, I'm going to encourage them to not only, look at fixer-upper opportunity, depending on who they are. I may recommend that they take on a turnkey opportunity, or they invest money in a note or a paper asset, if that makes sense. So part of the process is getting a feel for my client and, trying to help them understand what the process is really like so that they don't get in hot water. Because some of my clients, I've been able to help them through the process, and it was quite challenging. We've done multiple deals with a lot of my clients, and what I noticed was that, hey, like, just because they have money and a willingness to do X, Y, and Z, and they pay me to do it, doesn't necessarily mean that it's a good idea for me to take them down that road. So I feel like it's my duty, and I feel like they have to have the not just the capital and the willingness, but the capacity and the risk tolerance to get through that process. Or otherwise, they may not make it. They may lose money. The partnership or the relationship may get ruined. Okay, so this is huge. So once we find an opportunity, right? And once I find an opportunity in my team, however that looks, right? Then I have to dig in deeper into the numbers, okay? Since it may be a fixer-upper property, that means that I'm going to have to walk that property. That also means that I'm going to need to bring in a contractor to put the bid together, okay? So, part of me vetting out the client, me picking up their vibe, figuring out their risk tolerance, educating them, figuring out what's a good lane for them, okay? If we do find a neat opportunity, I have to dig in. So when I walk that property, I'm gonna walk it maybe with an app on my phone, or perhaps a notepad and a pen, and I'm gonna write down everything that I believe needs to be addressed, upgraded, or repaired in that property, okay? So that's another thing. That takes time, energy. I'm getting in my car, I'm driving across town, okay? Sometimes I need to get pictures, okay? I will do the initial scope of work, and it doesn't need to be super thorough, but it needs to have pretty good information as far as what the upgrades and repair needs are for that investment, okay? And then also, as part of this process, I'm going to get on multiple websites to determine what the property could rent for, okay? I'm gonna hop on the multiple listing service, okay? And I'm going to run comps to determine what the after repair value may be, and then also what the current value may be. All of this is time consuming, but it helps us to determine where we ought to be on the offer, okay? Because on the offer, right, and I don't work with fix and flippers anymore, so I have to mention that too. I only work with buy and hold investors now. I stopped working with rehabbers who wanted to do rehab and resell, aka fix and flip, back in 2017. Since then, I got close with a couple investors, and we discussed it, and then we ended up changing our mind because we realized that's not a very good business model for most people, okay? That's a whole other conversation. I could probably do a whole series on why short-term transactions can be beneficial, but I'm not gonna get into it today, all right? So the investors that I help, more often than not, it's a single family home. I'm going to help them through the process, buying it, and then they're going to hold it either as a rental or they're going to do seller financing on the back end as a way to create cash flow. Okay. So there was a lot there. Okay. I mentioned, let me recap on this because I want y'all to really grasp this, not just for the investors, but the service providers. It's key for the investors who want assistance through the process, right? So they can see what it really is, what it really entails, so that when they meet a good operator, maybe they'll want to pay them more, maybe they'll want to give them some grace, okay? So I mentioned the upfront fee, I mentioned the agreement, I mentioned casting a net, looking for opportunities, then digging into the deal, okay? Making sure that the deal aligns with the investor's, buy box, risk tolerance, willingness, and capacity for the buy and hold opportunity. Because not everybody needs to be taking on renovation projects. In fact, in this market, if you're not experienced, if you're not a contractor, you probably shouldn't, okay? Again, that's a whole other story. But then vetting out the opportunity, this is just on the front end. Then we gotta figure out where we're gonna come in on the offer, okay? If we're going to, rehab and refi, then we need to be strategic about where we come in. And this brings up a whole other topic of knowing the numbers, right? Where do we need to be, or where do we want to be as far as our all-in target? Meaning, what percentage of the after repair appraisal amount do we want to be all in for the purchase and the renovation? You factor in the closing costs, the holding costs, the overages on the renovation, and the list goes on. Okay. For context, when my business partner, one of my business partners and I were rocking and rolling pretty heavy through 2021, 2022, we used 80 to 85% of the after repair appraisal amount. Okay. So that means our target for the purchase and the renovation, plus some of the additional stuff, was 85% of the after repair value. That is somewhat aggressive, but because we knew that we were going to hold the property after, refinancing, of course you rehab it, you got to pay off the short-term debt, you got to recoup some of the capital if you can. We were more aggressive because we did seller financing as the exit strategy. Okay, I'm already going a little bit longer than anticipated, and I'm starting to get into some of the strategy and the higher level real estate investment stuff, which wasn't necessarily my purpose here. The purpose here was to talk about what I do as a real estate pro. But again, hopefully this is illuminating to y'all out there to see, like, there is a lot that goes into this process. And I need the assistance from my partners, from my team, from my associates, those other service providers to get through this process. Because, the upfront fee that I have received from my clients who I help through this process, some of that goes to pay the people that I work with. Some of it goes to cover fuel and food and appraisals. Some of it also covers, me paying for a bid that my contractor does, okay? And then, so it's almost like an advance, really, all right? To get through the vetting process, to find the really good opportunity. And then from there, getting to it, okay? So I know I've done other videos in the past talking about the operations, which I got into a little bit just now. And I also I have gotten into my real estate investor concierge program, which, is a higher level program that, I've taken these investors through, multiple times, and it's worked out beautifully for every single investor that's gone through it, right? So again, this is just to reiterate what I do as a real estate pro. And, I mentioned this is what I do when I work with a buyer, with an investor who I take on to help them acquire the property or an investment property of some type here in the Kansas City market, okay? And then if I'm going to take on a business partner, right? And he and I or she and I or going to have an entity together, and we are going to do the investment process, you know, side by side, more together. I'm not necessarily a third party, like I just mentioned, but I'm in on the deal, okay? And we proceed from there. I need to save that for the next video, okay? Because that is a whole other thing too. So let's leave it at that for today. I appreciate you tuning in. It's Luther Wilson. All right, take care until next time. Peace.